Mark, congratulations on this fantastic and massive book on the Beatles. This is only part one of the story. You must need a holiday after all the publicity duties. Where do you plan to go?
I have no time for a holiday, unfortunately. No, I'm doing all this, and then I've got to get on with the researching and writing of the second one.
Ah, okay. Well, surely not Liverpool for a holiday destination, I think.
No, Liverpool is not a holiday for me. I know so many people up there. Yeah.
Well, one of the first questions that we'd like to ask you is about the title, because I've heard that at one stage it would be called The Complete Beatles Story or something like that, but finally you went for All These Years Tune In. Can you explain the title?
Yeah, I don't think there ever really was going to be any other title, except that we weren't yet sure what it would be. I mean, I was looking for ideas. It was never going to be anything like Complete or whatever. First of all, the series needs a title. This is the first of 3 volumes, and therefore the overall series needs to have a title. The publishers wanted it to begin with The Beatles because they felt that would be strong and would come up quickly on internet search engines. So it had to be The Beatles something. Mm-hmm. And I decided All These Years was good. It's a 3-word title, which I like. It's short. It's about this book is about all these years. It really is. It's about all these years in their lives, and it's about all these years in our lives. And it's also a line from a Beatles song. I didn't want to use a Beatles song title. I didn't even really want to use a lyric, but it's okay. It fits. And then each of the 3 books must have its own individual title to differentiate them. And Tune In is just a very good title for this first volume, because if you've read it, you'll know that it's about them tuning into particularly the music from America, rock and roll music, and tuning in their radios to hear it. And then it's about them as people, as lads, as boys, tuning into one another and deciding this was what they wanted to do. So I thought that was a good title.
Oh, yes, I think so too. And I read somewhere, though, that some people had the question whether it was in any way an allusion to the famous quote by Timothy Leary. But please tell me that the third part of your book is not going to be called Dropout.
It won't be called Dropout, no.
It's got nothing to do with it.
Well, the Leary quote actually begins with "Turn On."
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
So no, I've read people thinking that they know what the titles of the next 2 books will be, but actually even I don't know. So.
Okay, good.
Mark, were there any frustrations doing research for this book? I mean, were there people who didn't want to talk to you, or were there documents you couldn't find?
Not really, no. I mean, I didn't find everything, but I'm not sure that everything is out there still to be found. And pretty much everybody I tried to persuade to speak to me did so. I guess one frustration was that I waited a very long time for Neil Aspinall to say yes to doing an interview. For those listening who may not know, he was, of course, the Beatles' indispensable right-hand man. He basically managed them for the last 40 years. After the breakup, but he was with them all the way through from like 1959, 60, and went to school with Paul and George from 1953. But he didn't ever do interviews, and I understood why I was doing this book. He didn't do interviews. He was very hard to persuade, and then suddenly he left working for the Beatles, and he phoned me up and said, "Okay, let's do it." And we were going to do the interview with, I was going to just talk to him and talk to him and talk to him forever about all the different stories. And we did one session, and then suddenly he fell ill and died.
Yeah.
And that obviously was an enormous frustration and a great personal sadness as well.
You wanted to ask him a lot more, I think.
I could. I always enjoyed talking to Neil, and I could have talked to him at great length for this book, for all 3 volumes, and it would have been. He would have given me extraordinarily good stuff, which I think pretty much has gone to the grave with him. But having said that, it's not as if I don't have anything good for the next 2 volumes, or indeed for this one. So I have very strong material. I miss Neil, that's all.
Yeah. Before the release of this book, what Beatles books did you consider to be the best?
Well, there are so many, and there are so many kinds of Beatle books that it's very hard to answer that. Me personally, I when the books were coming out in the 1970s or late 1960s and through the 70s, they made a big impact on me because I didn't know much. I did like the Beatles. I thought I knew something about them, but turned out that I didn't really until I read these books. So those books from like 40 years ago are still the ones that I think of first. Books like The Beatles, an Illustrated Record by Roy Carr and Tony Tyler, Apple to the Core by Peter McCabe and Robert Sconfeld, Hunter Davis's biography of the Beatles, of course, which came out 45 years ago now. And those kind of books are the ones that I still think of. But there are lots of good books on the Beatles, as well as lots of bad books on the Beatles.
I always was very impressed by the first part of Bob Spitz's Beatles biography. What do you think of that?
I don't like it.
You don't like it? Okay.
I don't think it's a good book.
Okay, and why not?
He didn't understand the subject. I feel there's too much of him in it, and not enough of the story. And he doesn't understand it properly. So partly because he's not English, and I don't think that an American can ever really understand the Beatles in the same way that an Englishman can. Just as I wouldn't really ever really be able to write as well about an American subject as an American.
And Peter Brown, Paul McCartney didn't like it. His book.
I like Peter Brown as a person.
Yeah.
And he's been fantastic for me on this book. He's given me great interviews and also access to some paperwork. But his own book was, it had his name on it, but I think it was mostly written by a journalist.
Yeah.
And it upset a lot of people, and it's not entirely right, and it's a strange book. I kind of wish he hadn't done it, really, because people don't like him as a result of it. And actually, I find him quite a nice bloke.
Mark, sometimes I get the feeling these days that our quest for knowledge of the Beatles is bigger than ever. For example, a short while ago, Rose Martin died. She was the housekeeper of Paul McCartney, and this was like a major news fact in Beatle fora and on the internet. And has it always been like this? When you started out researching the Beatles at the end of the 70s, was there ever a period when the Beatles were, kind of out of style, or people didn't really want to dig for every little thing that we now think is relevant?
Well, at the end of the 1970s, it was still quite close to the end of the 1960s, and it was quite hard to be someone who studied the Beatles in those days, because no one, in England certainly, music had moved on, and the Beatles were like, oh, that's years ago, and no one was really that interested. I think it changed when John Lennon died. That seemed to be the great spark of interest on a deeper level. Mm. And that's when the industry, as I call it, the Beatles industry, really began. But obviously we now live in the age of the internet, and everything can be big for a moment. The death of Rose Martin, who I did meet once or twice, was only big on the Beatles news pages, and only for a day. I mean, I don't think anyone got...
Yes, well, of course, but I can't think...
For the McCartney family, it was sad that she went, but no, everything can look big for a brief while these days, can't it?
Yeah. It's sometimes hard to measure what are really the relevant facts.
Well, yeah, I suppose so, but that's my job. That's where my job comes in, because I'm much less interested in the true trivia. I'm much more interested in understanding this story, finding out what I can that's relevant to understand how these people did what they did, who they are, and who are they, and how did they do it. So you obviously you need to do research, but you need to know where not to do research as well.
Okay, Mark, I want to play you a few lines from the song "Early Days" from Paul McCartney's album "New," which has also just been released. Do you feel these words apply to you?
They kind of, in a way, they apply to me and to many others as well. He's not really having a dig at me as such, but I think he's looking at
people
the industry. Yeah. The industry of people who think they know everything about the Beatles. Or I think really this has been building for a while, and it really came to a head when he was on tour in America this year and performed the "Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite." And everyone said, "You can't do that. It's a John Lennon song." And he said, well, actually, who are you to say that? I was there in the room when he did it. You weren't there. I consider myself part of the composition of that song. And I could see that it annoyed him. And I'm not surprised that there's suddenly now a song. I'm quite pleased that it's come out the same week as my book. But there, in the spectrum of life, there are people who will just shoot their mouth off about something they don't know very much about, and they think their opinion is right. And we now live in a world where, with the internet and social media, everyone can have their say and broadcast it, including a complete load of rubbish. Or there are people who make a proper study of something as a work of history and do it really properly, and don't pretend that they were there, and actually don't write anything they're not certain about and can back up. And I believe I fall into the latter category. So I don't really think he's having a pop at me, as more just the whole of the internet age and the whole of everybody who thinks they know the Beatles story.
Do you know what he thinks about the book? He was not consulted, right?
He helped me with a few bits of help, questions that I needed answering, and he provided me with a couple of photographs. Okay. But otherwise, no, he didn't really want to get involved. And that was fine by me, because I've interviewed him a lot myself down the years, about 15 interviews, and I used all that anyway. And if they get involved these days, they like to control things, and it's very, very important, crucial that this book is independent. It must be independent. It must be seen to be independent and not in any way have anything removed because someone said, "Oh, would you mind taking that bit out? Thank you." Yeah. So I don't mind that they're not involved. It's fine. It's really fine. It's this book must be independent, and it's the right way to do it.
So it's a good thing he didn't want to cooperate.
Well, I mean, obviously, if I could have had the cooperation on my terms, where he just answered some, gave me an interview or two, but didn't own it in any way, then that would have been good. But when I interviewed him in the past, the events that he was describing were a lot closer to happening than they are now. Everything is now 50 years ago. And it's quite clear from the interviews that they give that their own memories are not perfect anymore. And I'm not putting any of my opinions in this book. This book is them saying it almost all the way through from other interviews, and I always say where they came from. So it's okay. It's really okay.
And it's also, I think, one of the really great strengths of this book, that it's just objective. It's just presenting the facts. Sometimes there's a little opinion here and there, but nowhere there's a place where you interpret things and there are no facts really.
That's right. And I show where things come from. Yeah. And they obviously, I mean, how would you feel if you were the subject of like 500 books and you knew from glancing through some of them that they are flawed in one way or another? How would you feel about the Beatle book industry and the people who write those books? You'd have a definite view by now, wouldn't you? You would. They do, and they don't like them. They've had enough of them. They know that it's wrong. A lot of them are, making silly mistakes. So naturally, they kind of have this blanket view of all of them. But this one, if they see it, they'll know it's different, and they'll know anyway that it comes from a different cloth, because they used to employ me because they liked me, because they knew I was good at what I did. So they know I can do my job, because I used to do it for them.
A month ago there was a discussion in a Dutch TV magazine, if it was truth or legend, that the Sailors brought new records from the United States to Liverpool. What can you tell us about that? Is it true or is it a legend?
Well, I'm not saying that the Sailors did not bring records, because I'm sure some of them did, but the Beatles themselves did not get their music from Sailors. They got it from record shops. They got it from shops like anybody else goes in and hears or buys a record, because all of the record companies in Britain, based in London, had licensing arrangements with American record companies across the Atlantic, and the best of the American music was released on British record labels and available in shops all over the country, and the Beatles got their records from shops and not ships.
We know something about the musical roots of Paul and Ringo, but what were the main influences on George and John before rock and roll and skiffle?
I would say that it was obviously, in George's case, his dad had some records, some of which had been brought back from America in the 1920s, and things like Cab Calloway, that kind of music that George liked, the Singing Brakeman, Jimmy Rogers. And he liked George Formby records, kind of British music hall comedy records. There was music around. John had a musical upbringing without necessarily knowing it very well, because both his parents were musical, but he didn't live with them. So he wouldn't have been exposed completely to his parental influence of music, but they were both musical. His dad played harmonica. His father played harmonica. John's mother played banjo and taught him to play banjo eventually when he was about 16, 17. But all of them listened to the radio when they were growing up, because the radio would have been on in the house when they were growing up. And in those days, we didn't have stations devoted to particular kinds of music like now, where you've got a rock radio station or a country radio station or a heavy metal radio station. The radio played some music some of the time, and they played all music for all tastes, because the BBC is funded by license fee payers. So if you just play music for teenagers, everybody else is going to get upset.
Yeah. There was Radio Luxembourg, wasn't it?
There was Radio Luxembourg, but as I know from my own personal experience, if you listen to Radio Luxembourg in the UK, it was a really hard thing to do, because the sound would just be drifting in and out, and the sound would go, and then maybe half a minute later it might come back, and it was really difficult. But they did try to listen to Luxembourg, and on Luxembourg you could hear other things. But in their formative years, in their influential years of their childhood, they heard what was on the BBC. Yeah. And because the BBC had to play all music for everybody, the Beatles were exposed to all styles of music, and this is why they were so versatile musically themselves. If they had just grown up listening to rock and roll, they wouldn't have known anything else. We have the BBC, in a way, to thank for the fact that they knew so many other things.
Mark, your plan was to finally tell the true story of the Beatles and check everything through official documents like contracts and newspapers and people who were witnesses to the stories we all know. The result is that certain Beatle myths get crushed. Things we believe to be true turn out to be not so true. What would you say was the biggest myth that you'd crushed, and were you most surprised by?
Well, I call this book anti-myth. I'm not interested in myths anymore, because myths are just part. The only thing that interests me about myths is how they formed in the first place and why and who started it. I'm not otherwise interested in them. So I decided at the beginning I wasn't going to be bringing up Beatle myths in order to say, this thing, it's not true. I'm just telling the story, and the myths can just kind of fall away on the side along the way. So I don't really, there are just so many, and I'm not interested really. It's we talked about one just now, didn't we? About everybody says the Beatles, they got their music from the sailors who brought it back from America.
Yeah.
Right? And that's in every book. It's in every radio documentary. It's in every film and TV program. And everybody, even those who don't know much about the Beatles, will say, "Oh yeah, they got their music from American sailors or British sailors, bringing them back from New York." Well, there's one. Yeah. There's one, because that's a complete myth. Yeah. So they happen all the way through, and forgive me, but I don't think about them anymore. I much rather think about what did happen rather than what people think happened.
So if I hear you correctly, then I guess you won't be too enthusiastic about a biopic like Nowhere Boy, for example.
I don't like any biopics about anybody ever.
That's the
I don't like any Beatle biopics or anything, because they deviate from the truth too much. I like the truth. And in this story, the Beatles story, it's just, the truth is so extraordinary, so interesting, so exciting. You don't need to make anything up.
Well, can we go back to one of those very exciting events? That was the fateful day of July 6, 1957, the Woolton Village Fete, where Paul first met John. Let's hear a little piece of Putting on the Style, recorded that very same day. I had never heard this until a few months ago, actually reading your book. Can we ask you to read a little passage from your book where you describe this evening performance of the Quarrymen?
I would gladly do it, but I don't have the book here.
Oh, okay, that's too bad. Because, well, it's the piece where you actually say that John Lennon really developed his own voice already at that very early stage.
Yeah, well, I can sum up what I say in the book if you like.
Okay, good.
That, for anybody who sings on stage in public, or indeed even just in the bath at home, 99,000 people out of 99,001, everybody except John Lennon basically would begin by adapting their voice to the song that they're singing, the version that they've heard of it. They might sing in an American voice or in the voice of the original artist. And then eventually, if you stay in the profession of singing, your own personality, your own voice will emerge, if you're lucky, if you're good. But the extraordinary thing about this recording of John Lennon at the age of 16 is to hear that he sounds like only John Lennon. He doesn't sound American, he doesn't sound like the record, he is just himself. And that is the sign of a true original.
Well, those are the exact words that I wanted you to read, a true original. And, I just want to say this, the way that you put it on paper just gave me the chills. It was really, really special to read. And you really know how to make an event like this so special by just putting words on paper.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much.
How did you, isn't it amazing that this piece of music only was discovered so late as 1994? How did that happen? What can you tell us about that?
Well, the boy who recorded it, whose name was Bob Molyneux, he went to the youth club, same youth club as John Lennon, and knew some of the Quarrymen. And the youth club was affiliated to the church, and the church ran the fete at which this was recorded, the dance in the evening of the fete. And he had just got himself a tape recorder, which were, just becoming, for some people, a hobby in the 1950s. It was meant to be portable, but it wasn't something you could put in your pocket. It was this huge thing that he lugged down the hill, set it up in the church hall, and recorded most of the evening, I believe, on more than one spool of tape. There's only one spool of tape left now, because in the intervening years, the others got lost or recorded over. But by 1994, one of them still survived, and none of us knew anything about it. I remember quite vividly still being where I was when I received a phone call from Sotheby's in London to say they'd been contacted by someone in the south of England who had a tape of the Quarrymen playing on the day that John Lennon met Paul McCartney from 1957. And it's like, oh, come on, don't be ridiculous. I mean, the fact that we had a photograph of it was really quite amazing in itself. Yeah. But I went down to the man's house and he put it on, and it was unmistakably John Lennon, and it was unmistakably the event, and he remembered it, he described it, he still had the program, the souvenir program, and it was the real thing. And it was just like, well, you never say never in this story, or in life generally, but certainly with the Beatles, things are constantly surprising. Things turn up that you didn't even know existed.
Do you think there are any other musical fragments that might pop up someday? For example, maybe a tape of the first tour through Scotland, for example, where I think nothing was.
Well, that would be absolutely ridiculous, and therefore, yes, it's probably going to happen. I mean, I don't know what I don't know about, but I do know that the surprises are happening all the time, and long may that last.
In 1958, the Quarrymen made their very first recording in probably Liverpool's only recording studio, the living room of Percy Phillips. They recorded That'll Be the Day and this song.
Anything you want me to,
Yeah. Mark, please, can you tell us something about this song, the collaboration between McCartney and Harrison?
Well, originally, I first heard about the title "In Spite of All the Danger" in about 1979-80, and it was just like, what's that? What's this song? And then it transpired in 1981 that a copy of the record was still in existence, two-sided record made by the Quarrymen in a little private studio, as you say, and one of them was "In Spite of All the Danger," and it says underneath it, McCartney-Harris. Well, I still hadn't heard it in 1987 when I first interviewed Paul McCartney, and I asked him about it, and he said really it was his song, but George Harrison came up with the guitar solo in the middle, and because of that, they thought that meant he deserved a songwriting credit. So that's as far as we know, that's the only bit of the song that George actually wrote, just putting together the notes for the solo. But otherwise, the song is a Paul McCartney song, and it's it's nicked from "Trying to Get to You" on Elvis Presley's first LP, which he played a lot at that time with his friend Ian James. They used to play that album all the time, and they both liked "Trying to Get to You." This is one of the very earliest Paul McCartney songs, and it's obviously pretty much the same notes, but just with different words.
Yeah. And John sings it, right? That's kind of strange because it's a pop song.
Yeah. And then there was an interview with John from, I think, 1975 in America by a journalist called Paul Drew, in which John says, there's this record we made a long time ago, and I mean, he hadn't heard it since, so it was like 17 years later he was talking about it. And he said, and I was such a bully in those days, I sang the song that Paul wrote.
The relationship between Paul and George is an interesting one, because I have a feeling they were never really friends. What's your opinion about that?
Oh, they were definitely friends.
Yeah,
definitely friends for a very long time. It was Paul who brought George into the group. No, they were friends, but there was an age difference between them, which, as George often pointed out, especially in later years, Paul regularly reminded him about. Yeah. In other words, Paul was slightly superior to him for being what they thought was 9 months older. Actually, it's more like 8, but that was the thing. In Anthology, George says, Paul was 9 months older than me. In fact, he's still 9 months older than me. And although that's a joke, it's also an in-joke, because anyone who knows George or knew George, especially in the 1990s, will tell you that he was very tired of Paul reminding him that he was still 9 months older. But they definitely had a really good friendship. They had a couple of great holidays together in this first book in 1958 and 59 that John wasn't on. And no, they were close, but
but Paul's friend Ian James says he was surprised they even became friends.
Yes, well, it was the guitar, and also the guitar was a big thing, of course. So if you were into music and you dressed in a particular way and you listened to certain records and you played guitar, you had so much in common to begin with that other differences were less important. But actually, I don't know quite why Ian says that anyway, because Paul and George had grown up on almost the same street in Speke in the south end of Liverpool, and they'd seen each other before they ever got to speak. They kind of recognized each other, and they were definitely really good friends all the way through. But both of them got on better with John.
Well, in 1960, they recorded several songs on a tape recorder at Paul's house on Fort Lynn Road. For example, this Lennon-McCartney original. Song is probably called "You Must Write Every Day." And from 1959 onwards, John and Paul wrote their own songs. And Paul always claims in interviews that the main reason they started to write songs is that because all the groups in Liverpool played the same cover songs and they didn't want to play the same songs as the others. Do you think that story is true?
Well, I know why he says it, but it's actually he's conflating several years here. The chronology, as it now seems clear, is that John and Paul wrote songs separately before they met, or at least before they got together. And then they started to write together, and then they stopped, and then they wrote separately again. But John hardly wrote at all. Most of the songs from 1959 are Paul's. Then in 1960 and 61, they appeared to write nothing at all, either of them. And then they began writing again in '62, and it was at that point, I think, that Paul's story becomes true.
Okay.
But even still, they were reluctant to play their own songs to their audiences in Liverpool until Brian Epstein encouraged them to do it. So as soon as they become managed by Brian, they start doing their own songs on stage, and that obviously creates a difference between them.
Hamburg was their second home, the city where they grew up to become real musicians. This is Sweet Little 16 from the Star Club in Hamburg, recorded in December '62.
Really rockin' it.
Interestingly enough, the Beatles traveled through Holland when they first went to Hamburg. You mentioned the famous story of John stealing an harmonica in a music shop in Arnhem, a story that the Dutch are really proud of. Is that the same harmonica that is used on Love Me Do and From Me to You?
I don't know. I don't know if it is or not, and I say that in the book. Anything I'm not sure about, I say that I'm not sure. And I don't know if it was the same harmonica or not, because I don't know exactly what harmonica he used. I haven't seen photograph of it to compare it to the...
Yeah.
Even we don't really know even which one he stole from the shop in Arnhem.
Did you make many trips to Hamburg to research?
Yeah, I went there 3 times, yeah. And I went to Arnhem, and I went to the shop, and I went to the cemetery at Oosterbeek, where they stopped and had their photograph taken.
Was it the only time they visit Holland on their trips to Hamburg, or did they visit Holland more often?
No, because in 1961 they went to Hamburg from England and back again on the boat and train.
Okay.
So they sped through on the train from Hoek van Holland across to the German border in 1961. And then in 1962, for all 3 trips, they flew.
Okay, but was this first trip abroad, the UK, outside the UK? They never visit any country. Holland?
No, none of them had passports before this. So Holland was actually the first country.
Yeah,
Mark, there's also a story that in the same shop in Arnhem, the other boys stole all the cookies from a box as well that was on the counter. This is not mentioned in your book. So I'm concerned. Is the story false, or did we catch great Mark Lewisohn forgetting something?
I don't know anything about that one. Is that true?
It's part of Dutch folklore, I think. I read it on the internet as well, but I don't know if it's true.
Right.
But
Well, it must be true if it's on the internet. Yeah.
Can you tell something about those trips to Hamburg that you made? How difficult is it to get in touch with people who were there like many nights when the Beatles played there, or
It's not easy because a lot of the people in the audiences were sailors or they were drunk people, and they would. So the Beatles were a bar band, and even if you were in the same bar as the Beatles when they were playing, you weren't necessarily paying them any attention. These were not concerts. So it wasn't easy, but I went there and I very discreetly asked for people to come forward. I attended an event at which a few people came up to me and spoke to me, and I had a piece in a newspaper. But I didn't need many either. I just needed half a dozen people, maybe 5 or 6 people. That was good enough for me. But most of the time I was in Hamburg, I was in archives and libraries looking things up with the aid of a translator to help me understand.
Mark, we're continuing with the famous Deca edition, January 1st, 1962. Among the songs they played was Searchin', originally by the Coasters. The Beatles were famously rejected by Deca, by a man called Dick Rowe. Was he right by not giving the Beatles a contract?
Yeah, well, the first thing to say is that they weren't very good that day, the Beatles. They were not yet confident in the recording studio. They were nervous, they were cold, they did not give a good performance. And Pete was still on drums, and they never really sounded anything like as good with Pete on drums as they did with Ringo. So history tells us that they did not get the contract, but at the same time, I personally, and I think probably most fans would think the same, very, very happy that they were rejected by Deca, because it was the wrong company and they would have had the wrong producer, and everything could have been, and probably would have been, very, very different than how it turned out when they went to EMI and met George Martin. George Martin was the best producer they could ever have had, and anybody at Deca would not have been.
You try to be objective in your book, but I get the feeling that you aren't a big fan of Pete Best's drum work. Let's compare his drumming on Love Me Do with that of Ringo. This is Ringo.
Okay.
Love me do.
So that's Ringo. And now Pete.
Love me do.
Well, there's a very clear difference, as you can hear. Drumming by Pete is not very tight, very unimaginative. It doesn't fit the song at all. Is his drumming the main reason why Pete Best was fired from the Beatles?
Well, yes. The main reason that Pete was dismissed from the Beatles was because John, Paul, and George did not think his drumming good enough. He was never really good enough for them in terms of what they wanted, but they put up with it for a long time because it suited them to have the best family, Pete's family, run their organization, which is kind of, they looked after the gear and they drove them to the dates and they arranged the bookings as well. When the Beatles didn't have a manager, the Best family were really kind of running things. But they were never happy with his drumming, and that was true from the start. In fact, it's even kind of true in a way from before the start, because before they got Pete as a drummer, John, Paul, and George needed a drummer, and they knew that he had a kit, and they still weren't going for him. They went for him only because they were about to go to Hamburg, and they were desperate. If they hadn't have got a drummer, they couldn't have gone, and they were desperate to go, so they grabbed Pete and went. And what they found when they got there was that he was pretty much a complete beginner. And from their point of view, he never really was good enough for them. And that combined with his personality, which was very, very unlike theirs, and the fact that he was quiet and always liked to go off on his own, never hang around with the other three of them, they never really felt that he was a true part of the group. Simple as that.
Mm-hmm. Had they played with Pete before they went to Hamburg?
No.
How could they know what his quality as a drummer was then?
They didn't, except that they had a little bit of an audition for him just before they went to Hamburg. But as everybody says, he couldn't have failed that audition. Okay. They were so desperate that no matter what, even if he played drums with the sticks between his toes, they would have taken him.
Well, one of the very fascinating things in your book is just this constant quest for drummers that's just dominating the whole Quarryman career, I guess, for almost 3 years, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. They were always looking for a drummer, and as John wrote once, a series of drums came and went. Paul was drummer for a while in 1960, and they all took turns on drums, and they could all do it. But at the same time, they knew that they really did need to get themselves a drummer, and they were hard to find. Pete was there. They knew that. They didn't bother going for him, but then eventually they did, and he ended up staying much longer than they wanted him to, which was 2 years, partly because they didn't want the side effects, if you like, or they didn't want the response and reaction from Pete when they did it, when they fired him. So they waited until they had a manager and made the manager do it.
Mark, in November there will be an even bigger edition of Tune In. That's twice as long.
Yeah.
I call myself a Beatles geek, so I tend to wait for the extended edition. On the other hand, I'm afraid it mainly consists of a lot of background information on Liverpool and the family history of the Beatles. But mainly I want to read stories about the Beatles themselves. So which version do you recommend for me?
I would recommend both of them. I mean, to me, the long version is the one that I wrote. That's the book as I wrote it. That's the story as I believe it needs to be told to be properly understood, so that you as the reader will know who the Beatles were more than ever before, and get a clearer sense of their personalities than ever before, and their chemistry. But there's a lot more about them in the bigger version. There is also more context as well, but I believe it's context that is necessary. Otherwise, I wouldn't have written it. Mm-hmm. So, and there's a lot more Beatles in the other book as well. Okay. It's not just context.
Can you give an example of a story you left out of the mass market edition, but included in the extended one? Just to appetize.
Haven't been asked that question. There's a whole chapter that I took out of that book, which is still in the it's in the extended edition, but not in the other one. And it's a short chapter of all the girls and boys who loved the Beatles down the cavern, talking about what it was about John, Paul, George, and Ringo that they found so extraordinary and so exciting. So it's a succession of very interesting, amusing, fascinating stories about the Beatles that aren't anywhere else in the book, because I just removed the entire chapter.
Must have been difficult for you to cut your baby.
It was terribly hard. Yeah. But I always had the satisfaction of knowing that the other version, the full uncut edition, was coming out. So that made it a bit easier. But no, it was very difficult. But there is more. There's more about George Martin, and there's more about Brian Epstein, and there's more about Liverpool, and there's more about John, Paul, George, Ringo, Stuart, Pete, and everybody.
Okay. Well, sounds interesting. I think I'm going to buy the extended one. Period.
Good man. That's what I wanted to hear.
I knew you would. Yeah.
Mark, you have some friends here in Holland. What can you tell us about them? Because one of them showed you the Mahler biography. What is that story behind that?
Yes. Well, a few years ago, I was in the very happy habit of coming to Amsterdam for vacations as often as possible. I love Amsterdam, and came over many times. And I've long had a friend there in Amsterdam called Pete Schroeders. Yeah. I've written books with Pete, and we've been friends for about nearly 30 years. And he introduced me to many of his friends, so they became my friends as well. And one of them was this guy called Harry Claassen, who lives in Amsterdam. He's a great reader of books. He has a huge library of books, and he's a big fan of the Beatles and also a big fan of classical music. And he writes music himself. And he pointed to this biographical series about Mahler one day when I was in his apartment in Amsterdam, and he said, the Beatles should have a book like this. They deserve something this comprehensive, this thorough. The story is so rich that you could do it, or it needs to be done, and you, Mark, you are the person to do it. And it actually kind of arrived at a good time in my own life when I was thinking of doing something on the Beatles again. I wanted to write a biography and not a reference book. All my other books have been reference books, and it just kind of it fitted. And I just thought, I think he's right, and that was how the idea happened.
Is it hard to change the style? Because when you write a reference book, it's obviously a completely other way of writing than when you write a biography. Did you have any difficulties with that in the beginning?
No, because I did write a biography a few years ago of the comedian Benny Hill, and that's how I learned to write biography. So I just carried on doing the same thing, really, with this one. Even in my reference books, there would be pieces of longer text, like at the beginning of each year I would do a kind of overview. But I mean, I was a lot younger then.
I'm not suggesting in any way that you do not have the quality to be a good biographer, not in any way. But
no, I know what you mean. But it's a different discipline, of course it is. Writing short entries to writing something long, it takes a lot more planning with the long. But I'm a good planner. I just have. Everybody in life has a strength that is unique to them or particular to them, and I'm not very good at putting up shelves, and I'm not very good at drilling or doing other things that men do. But I'm very good at research, and I'm good at organization. I'm good at administration, and I like writing about the Beatles. So those happen to be my skills, and I'm very fortunate in that respect.
Well, talking about planning, I'm not going to ask you when part 2 and 3 will appear. I will just wait very patiently. A question I would like to ask, though, is will the other parts contain as many sex parts as part 1? Because now we know when each Beatle had sex for the first time, We know that John and Cynthia had a fantastic sex life once John left Mandips. I sometimes wonder, do we really want to know all that?
I don't really talk about their sex lives that much, but obviously if you take, there's a reference here and a reference there and a reference here and a reference, and you put it all together, it sounds like I do. I'm not obsessive about their sex lives.
I know.
But we are all sexual beings, and the Beatles' own sexuality is important to understand in the sense of what they did with it when they went around the world, because they actually had quite a lot of good times on tours. And I think it's important, if you're writing a true biography, to talk about every aspect of a person's life. I don't go into what they liked in sex. That would be that's private, and besides which I don't know, and I wouldn't put it in even if I did know. But I think it's relevant that John Lennon had a very active sex life, because he had a very active life in all ways. His sex life was just another extension of himself, in that he lived it to the full. Yeah. But otherwise, I mean, they all had lots of girlfriends and lots of affairs, and I think that's important to understand, even if I don't go into the details.
Yeah. Mark, we would like to thank you very much for this interview. And one last question. One of the subjects we want to cover in a future episode of this podcast series is, what if the Beatles were to release Anthology 4? What should be on it? For instance, Paul's demo for Goodbye, or What You're Doing, take 11.
What you're doing.
You know what's in the vault. What hidden gems are still there?
Well, the Goodbye demo isn't in the vault.
That's true.
That just exists as an acetate. The EMI archive, the key people whose decision this is, they feel that they've taken the best, what was unreleased, that they've taken the best of that material and now released it. So, I mean, I disagree. I would like to see all of it out, and I would like to see absolutely everything, and I would also like there to be an Anthology 4 and 5 and 6 and 7, but I don't think it's going to happen. But you've just played those, you're talking about those tracks, Goodbye and What You're Doing, and all the others that you would have on Anthology 4. You've already got them.
Yeah, that's true, on a bootleg, but maybe in better sound quality if they're properly released.
And we don't have a long Helter Skelter. You were very enthusiastic about that one. The long one.
Yeah, I enjoyed hearing that. It was great to hear it. I know that is kind of the holy grail for Beatles fans. Got to hear that. I hope it comes out. I tried to push for it to be on Anthology 3. I made a strong case for it, but they didn't want to do it. So, they didn't do it.
Carnival of Light?
Carnival of Lights I don't know if that'll ever come out. It's on the internet, but it isn't the real thing. It's just someone's made it up. Yeah. But the real Carnival of Light, it's awful. It's just awful.
That's good. Heard that before.
It's just like you might. It's almost better not to know what it sounds like. It's just awful. The point is that I think that as time goes by, I personally begin to feel that it doesn't matter what label things are on, as long as we've got it. If I've got the opportunity to play What You're Doing or Goodbye or whatever it might be, then it doesn't need to be on an official release. It's just out there and in circulation, and that's good enough for me. But of course, as I did say at the beginning, I would like everything to be released. It just doesn't matter what label it's on.
One final question, Mark. We are only just starting this podcast, the three of us, and we were looking for a fourth member, and it should be someone who has above average knowledge of the Beatles. So, what do you think?
Well, if you want to pay for me to fly to Amsterdam every weekend, I would enjoy that. And no, I wish you good luck with it. It sounds like you. I mean, you obviously from your questions, you know what you're talking about. So it's going to be good, and you won't necessarily have me as a presenter, but you will have me as a listener.
That's great.
Thank you very much for this interview.
Thank you so much for your interest in this.